So growth is a natural phase, but it's a phase. It's a temporary phase. It's a transition from one phase to another phase. It might be a transition of growth into a decline phase, or it might be a transition from growth into a steady state, or some sort of oscillating kind of dynamic equilibrium. But it's never just a constant phase. At one time horizon, we have the urgency of addressing climate change. What we need is phenomenal growth in the solutions to climate change. Most notably, the energy transition, away from a fossil fuel energy towards a renewable energy future. But then it's happening within a bigger story or conversation that we're not having, at least not at the levels that we need to be. We've got the degrowth conversation is making its way gradually in.
So I wanted to first start off by getting a bit of introduction of who you are, James, and then we can dive into how you sort of came into this world of degrowth or sustainability. And yeah, so love to get to know a bit about your story and how you ended up doing your research.
I'd love to be able to say, oh, well, I just sort of, did this and then that, and had this kind of linear trajectory.
Yeah.
But I guess the backstory, the origin story, as a kid, very interested in the environment and sort of writing letters to the editor and things like that, saying we need to stop using plastic and polluting, and we need to stop cutting down trees, and in that kind of childlike sort of way. And then, went through university, studied engineering and environmental management, and the timing of that. So I was at university started in the year 2000 as an undergraduate student. So for the benefit of your listeners who are, I'm guessing, university age, university student age now, so that we're sort of talking about maybe around about the time a lot of your listeners were born, we had the September 11 sort of terrorism and following war in Iraq, and there was a bit of a so I was a university student at the time of all of that crisis, and I became very interested in left-wing ideas, and got to the end of my degree and thought, well, I'd like to contribute to sort of the knowledge that might be part of the solution to some of these systemic problems. I don't want to graduate from my engineering degree and go and become sort of a cog in a machine that is contributing more to what I perceive to be those problems. I've softened that view, I think, since then, because in part because I'm now working at a university, madly trying to graduate plenty of engineering graduates to go and work in the system. And I think I have a different view of the role that people play than I did perhaps 20 years ago, when I was starting to think, no, I want to, damn the system, I'm going to go and do something else. Anyway, in that mindset, as I was, what I went and did was I went and did a PhD, immersed myself in sort of environmental science. Wasn't in a topic remotely related to what we're talking about today. I was modeling how water flows in aquifers and things like that. It was quite interesting, but it was not connected to this. But at that time, as I was in that sort of immersed in knowledge and information, and as well as having come from that left-wing political sort of attraction, became very interested in limits to growth, became very interested in peak oil, so now we're talking timeline. We've moved past September 11, we've moved past the start of the Iraq War, and we're now in circa 2005, 2007, and peak oil became the lead up to the global financial crisis. Oil prices were ramping up. People were talking about running short on oil and reaching that inflection point, or that turning point from a history of growing oil to a future of declining oil. I became fascinated in that and realized there wasn't a lot of scientific research that's been done on it. So the transition in terms of my scholarly career has been starting to engage in that space, in modeling those things, and sort of realizing, wow, we really have a blind spot in the academic discourse when it comes to studying a future that isn't a growth future, right? We have, and so I was initially looking at that through the potential of this kind of coming energy shock, and then looking at how that blind spot actually, in strange ways, it informs some of our predictions about things like climate change, in a really strange way, where you have our failure to conceptualize a future that is a declining future means that we conceptualize futures of massive growth in fossil fuels that generates outlandishly high sort of greenhouse gas emissions. It follows that the more greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, the bigger the climate change problem, and the less greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, the less the climate change problem. And so this is a really interesting intersection between this idea of a potential future that doesn't have continued growth in emissions, and what that might mean for climate change, but it also means when we're looking at the solutions to that problem in terms of changing from fossil fuels to renewable energy. If we, again, have that blind spot where we're not looking at futures outside of a growth future, we're only looking at growth futures, then we either have sort of on the one hand, a dirty growth future where we cook the planet, or on the other hand, we have a clean growth future where we solve the problem. And either way, we're growing and growing and growing. Everything's getting bigger. Everything's getting more affluent. There's more people consuming more, and they're either doing it in a dirty way that kills the planet or in a clean way that doesn't kill the planet. And they're the only futures that seem to be being considered in the mainstream. And so now in the time frame, we get back to 2016 when that paper was published that that Jason Hickel has cited, that you mentioned. So we take 1 year back, 2015, there was a study led by scientists at CSIRO, and it was basically a prediction of decoupling. I think it said, it didn't actually use the phrase Australia can have its cake and eat it, but it was a phrase similar to that, essentially saying we can decouple our economic growth from our environmental impact. And it was a very comprehensive study published in Nature, or a summary of it was published in Nature, attracted a lot of attention, and it really served the interests of the people who wanted to perpetuate this growth idea, that it was saying we definitely need to move away from that dirty growth future, but it was saying we've got this wonderful clean growth future, and we can miraculously solve the problems we know about. Essentially, the way I conceptualize it, or it's been better put by others. One of my colleagues, Sharon Eade, refers to growth as the denial phase, in the kind of the grief, the phases of grief. So it's the denial phase, or is the bargaining phase? It might be the bargaining phase, I think. So it's kind of saying, okay, if I'm an economist and I have to believe in the school of economic thought that I subscribe to is a growth school of thought, but I am also environmentally aware. How do I bring these two worlds together? Well, I bring it together with this idea of decoupling, where then I can kind of say, these are no longer in conflict. Somehow we can have our cake and we can eat it. And so the paper that we wrote was really a response. It was initially, we initially attempted to write a comment to Nature to directly challenge the paper. But because what they presented was not, they didn't make any kind of mathematical calculation errors. The parameters for submitting a comment in that journal, in some journals, this is the way publishing works. Unless you're actually saying there is an error here, there's no case. You're not bringing a case against that paper. And the error, really, as we were saying, was there was a philosophical error, right? There was, they didn't. If you subscribe to this idea that we can just keep growing, then there's nothing technically wrong. And as long as you don't make your projections past a certain point in time, and they projected out to 2050. So there was nothing mathematically incorrect in what they said, but the nomenclature of decoupling was really what we were challenging. So speaking of nomenclature, there are two basic forms of decoupling that are out there in the lexicon: absolute and relative. Now, absolute decoupling would imply that you have completely broken the link between the economic activity and the thing that you're trying to decouple from. So a good example would be whale oil. Okay, we don't currently have an economy that depends in any way on whale oil. A sort of a closer example historically would be lead in petrol. So I'm old enough to remember leaded petrol, and when it was phased out, and when we now fill up our vehicles with unleaded petrol, a lot of people perhaps aren't familiar with why it's called unleaded. It's a strange thing to put in front of petrol, but it used to have a compound of lead in it. It was horribly damaging to human health, and it was phased out. We now no longer, that's a decoupling. So some of these things, like ingredients that we can do without, it's like cutting something out of your diet. You can live without certain things. Relative decoupling, this is the sleight of hand. So still is referred to as decoupling, but relative decoupling, and this is what a lot of that CSIRO work was based on. It's where you say, well, we're defining that the rate of growth of the economy is faster than the rate of growth of the impact. So we can grow the economy faster, and we're kind of getting out in front. So what that really translates to, and I'm an engineer, so I think in physical terms, this is talking about gaining efficiency. So if I'm driving in a car, and say I'm driving in a manual car, and I get out onto the freeway, onto the highway, and I start to move up through the gears, every time I change gears, my rate of kind of speed increase relative to my rate of fuel consumption changes. So I'm able to relatively decouple because I'm moving faster while I'm not consuming that much more fuel, if that makes sense. Have I decoupled my actual transport, my actual movement from the consumption of fuel? Of course not. It's still consuming fuel. But that's the equivalent of this sort of relative decoupling. It's really just saying you're moving into more efficient modes. So all we did childishly simple set of calculations to basically say, well, if we accept that there are physical limits to that efficiency, then we can reinterpret those CSIRO predictions and see that if you extend the calculation beyond 2050, there's this rebound effect as you start to decrease. It's like a diminishing marginal returns kind of situation. You get to a point where you can't get much more efficient. And then if you're continuing to grow, it's like when I reach the top gear in my car on the highway, if I want to then keep on accelerating, I've got no more opportunity to become more efficient. I don't have an infinite number of gears. And so we saw that in all of the cases, those impacts were rebounding, and that if you just extended it another 50 years into the future, we'd be up well over where we started. So this idea that we can somehow halt the impact on the planet in order to keep growing our economy was demonstrably false. So that was the basis for our paper. At the same time, we sort of used it as an opportunity to critique some of the underlying principles of decoupling.
I think this is a good opportunity, James, to also dive into maybe the results of that research and really unpick what the implications of that are. Because if what the CSIRO is saying, and perhaps it would be worth expanding on the acronym of CSIRO, because it even escapes me at this moment. I just
Commonwealth Science and Industrial Research Organization.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it'd be great to just expand on those results of that study, because if that's the case, the research you've come across, then that has really big implications for how we live and how we should operate in society.
Mm.
And yet, if I look around me, if I think about my business education along with my friends who are overseas that receive a similar business education, not much concern for limits, with the continual perpetuating ideas of growth without any critical lens. I think it's not sufficient to have one lens, but multiple lenses, obviously, to expand your ability to criticize ideas and making sure the best idea wins. Anyways, that aside, I think it'd be great to dive into those results.
Yeah, so it's difficult because that study, and what was it called? It was called something like State of Australia report, but it wasn't called the State of Australia report. It escapes me now. But it was actually, I feel conflicted because it was, on the one hand, a really optimistic vision of where we could go, and it was effectively saying. So I have to applaud the scientists who put so much time into creating a vision for what the Australian economy could transition into, because it was sort of talking about, well, we go from a resource based heavy industry, or heavy resource extractive industry type economy, high reliance on coal and things like that, to a future that is carbon farming, and it's very green, and it was a great picture in some regards of that, what that transition could look like. But where it underdelivered, or it delivered, I think, an unhelpful kind of conclusion, was in that paper published in Nature, where they went out of their way to say Australia does not need to change its I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it's society. We do not need a societal transformation. We can continue to have the same values, economic values, and it was very clearly talking about growth. We do not need to
uphold the status quo, in a sense.
Yeah, we do not need to challenge the way, and it actually listed sort of different archetypal sort of viewpoints in order to basically say we don't need to go down any of these alternative paths that have been presented. We can maintain the growth path, and that's kind of a good message for capitalism. So even within their own results, because they were relying on relative decoupling, which is where the economy grows faster than the underlying impact. If we take energy use was still growing. So yes, we can go from fossil fuel sources of energy to renewable sources of energy, but if we sort of say, look, there's going to be a limit to how much energy we can produce even from renewable sources, because there's only so many areas we can plaster solar panels all over, or wind turbines, or other forms of renewable energy. We will eventually reach that limit too. So the fact that sort of the graph of the economy growing and the graph of the energy growing, they were both graphs going up. So it wasn't as though the energy graph was going down while the economy was going up, which might be the thing that frustrates me with the word decoupling. And even if you look at, say, I think it's the OECD's definition of decoupling in some manual from 20 years ago, it uses the phrase decoupling is about breaking the link. And that's, coming from an engineering background, if one thing is coupled to another thing and we decouple them, that makes sense. The metaphor is about breaking the link. So when you have two graphs that are going up, one of them might be going up more steeply than the other graph. I don't see those as being decoupled. It's kind of like, rather than breaking the link, we're kind of replacing it with more of an elastic thing.
Yeah.
So if we pull one, the other one's going to move with it. It's just going to kind of fall behind a little bit. But so then in the results for energy, that was what was happening. So they had energy and they had materials, and they were basically showing a dematerialization story. So they were going from a version of Australia that was this based on extractive industries and mining and things, and that basically meant that the starting point for Australia is that it's actually quite a material intensive economy. and they were essentially just mapping a transition to a far less materially intensive economy. And if you stop the clock at 2050 during that transition, it looks good. It looks like that is more like an absolute decoupling kind of story. But you need some materials. And so what we did was we sort of said, okay, well, let's look at where Australia currently sits in terms of how materially intensive and also how energy intensive is Australia at the moment. And then based on the predictions from that CSIRO modeling, where do they think Australia might be going? And in terms of, when I say where is Australia, I mean relative to other economies, other countries and their material use and their energy use in their economies. So we found Australia is already one of the most energy efficient economies in terms of the amount of GDP that we produce relative to the amount of energy that we consume. So the idea that we're going to become substantially more efficient might be true, but it basically means we're going to become off the charts in terms of if you look at a spread of current countries. The material story is a bit different because we're currently one of the more materially intensive economies, or at least we were back in 2015 when the study was done. And so the prediction then was that we were essentially going to go from one of the more materially intensive economies to become one of the least materially intensive economies. But you can't become a zero material. I mean, I wouldn't be talking to you through anything if we had no, I wouldn't be wearing anything, you know. I wouldn't have a glass to drink this water out of if we became a zero material economy. It doesn't make sense. So there's got to be some sort of limit. So in our results, or in our modeling, we sort of took the trajectory that they had and said, okay, well, let's take that as read. Let's take that as a realistic trajectory. But it doesn't end at zero. We don't get down to zero material use. It's got to bottom off, or bottom out really, at some minimum level. Now, we're not going to predict what that minimum level, we're not going to specify ahead of time what that level is. So I think we just allowed the model to basically kind of find a level. No, that's not true. We did specify it. Apologies. We specified it, but I think at half the level that they said was kind of like the ultimate level. So we sort of said, okay, you've been optimistic already, going from one of the most materially intensive economies to one of the least. And then we're going to say, let's continue that trend down another 50% less, so we can become kind of off the charts, or certainly at the lowest end of material use. And I think the energy story was they were already predicting that we'd go off the charts based on current economies, and we said, well, let's go even further. But let's recognize that there are physical limits. That there are physical limits to how materially efficient your economy can be, and how energy efficient your economy can be. And once you sort of say, okay, well, once we reach those, we're going to bottom out at those efficiency limits, then any further growth, and we just used the, just extrapolated that, it's around about a 3% per annum growth in economy. That's total GDP. So that accounts for, I think that's right. I think it was 3% total, accounting for per capita and population growth. So just extrapolating that trend out, then we just found that the material use inflected. So it followed, obviously it followed their prediction to 2050, and then it started to rebound, and I think it got back up to about 1.3 times where it started from. So it had this kind of temporary decoupling. It was never decoupled. It was just getting more efficient, and then the growth took over again, and it went back up and ended up higher. The energy story, if memory serves, ended up, it's an open access paper, find all the graphs. The energy story, I think, it never went down because it was only ever a relative decoupling story. But I believe that it ended up at something like 3 or 3.5 times the starting point. So there's just, unless you subscribe to this idea that you can call something decoupling when both things are still connected, which to
Mhm.
me is an oxymoron to begin with.
Yes.
It's a misappropriation of the term decoupling, and then you shouldn't be using the term decoupling anyway.
Mm.
So if you subscribe to that idea that you can somehow call this thing decoupling when it's not, then the story is, well, okay, the economy grew by a factor of whatever it was, 7 or 8
Yeah.
over this projection, and the energy use grew by a factor of 3 or 4.
Wow.
So it was, and that was based on continuing the idea of very, very optimistic efficiency gains.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a good way to summarize it would be to just read a very small extract from your paper, which I pulled, which I thought was, which is a fantastic summary of the paper, which you mentioned and your team mentions, that our model demonstrates that growth in GDP ultimately cannot be plausibly be decoupled from growth in material and energy use, demonstrating categorically that GDP growth cannot be sustained indefinitely. And then you go on to say it is therefore misleading to develop growth-oriented policy around the expectation that decoupling is possible, which I think is it perfectly summarizes your point that, you know, if energy consumption and material consumption still goes up with growth, even if it's relatively decoupled, then the impact is still going to be great. Because if the economy grows, if the economy grows 3% every 23 years, it doubles. It doubles every 23 years, I should say. So that means in like in 50 years time, then, you know, it's like doubling like twice, and it keeps going on. And so, I guess that's a problem, right? So what do you have any ideas of what we do about that? Because to me, that's quite a stark. I mean, you were mentioning earlier that it's quite optimistic that, you know, you were able to come up with such a great result in terms of what you found, and at the same time, I'm sure it would have be quite uncomfortable to see that, you know, the leading science body is coming up with that paper, which is sort of upholding status quo. And if you just tweak the model slightly, you can see that it would be problematic, right? So
it's not about tweaking the model; it's about applying. I would say it's about applying common sense. I mean, I'm almost embarrassed by how simplistic our calculation was. It did not take anything beyond about high school level maths to make it clear. Like, it doesn't take anything beyond high school maths to basically show that continued growth makes no sense, and it doesn't.
Yeah, it's so intuitive. I mean, I think that's why degrowth, in a sense, is I think quite a powerful idea, because lay people are able to easily conceptualize that if there's limits to things, you can't keep them growing. And yet it seems as though policymakers, which obviously are elected by their constituencies, so perhaps it's not the policymakers' fault, it's the constituency's fault. But in a sense, it seems very strange that there's quite an adverse reaction to questioning that status quo.
It is bizarre. There's absolutely nothing in the universe that grows forever exponentially. You know, we stop growing as organisms. Trees stop growing as organisms. You know, so growth is a natural phase, but it's a phase. It's a temporary phase. It's a transition from one phase to another phase. It might be a transition of growth into a decline phase, or it might be a transition from growth into a steady state, or some sort of oscillating kind of dynamic equilibrium. But it's never just a constant phase. So it's baffling. It continues to be baffling to me that we can delude ourselves into thinking growth is the normal state to be in. And so I'm...
And that's including green growth, correct, James? Because essentially what your paper is saying is that, you know, even if you were to invest in all these sorts of green ideas, you know, renewable technology, as important as they are to, you know, transition away from fossil fuels, even if you were to invest completely in green technologies, adopt something like a Green New Deal, where the idea is to grow as a result of investing in these green technologies. Nevertheless, decouple, your paper shows that eventually in 50 years time or more, that it's going to have devastating impacts on the environment. And as if things are not as bad, are not bad enough as they are, you know, even just the recent IPCC report said it was red alert. It's this is not the time to have discussions without any intent of changing about growth.
Yeah. So we've got a complicated situation on our hands because it's about kind of the scope of and the time horizon. So at one time horizon, we have the urgency of addressing climate change. What we need is phenomenal growth in the solutions to climate change. Most notably, the energy transition away from a fossil fuel energy towards a renewable energy future. On the longer time horizon, that's a circa, say 1 decade to 3 decades kind of conversation. If you look at a 1.5 degree future, 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, that's 8 years away, less than 8 years away. 100% reduction down to net zero by about 2050. That's only another 2 decades. So that's the well and truly within the career span of everyone who's currently at university or at a university age, entering the workforce or studying right now, is anticipating a career span that we should see that transition completed within that time frame. All right, so we've got that, which is a growth story. And if I was a company involved in renewable energy technology, I'd be super excited about the growth potential, because so there's that happening. But then it's happening within a bigger story or conversation that we're not having, at least not at the levels that we need to be. We've got the degrowth conversation is making its way gradually in, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But by and large, our society is not having the conversation at that sort of beyond the 2050, so to the 2100 or 2200, or actually starting to think on these long time scales, which seem, in some cases, I think part of the issue is that people assume those sorts of timeframes are irrelevant, and that's where we need to actually say, well, hang on a minute. We have continuous cultures in this country, in Australia, that have been going for at best kind of according to sort of Western estimates, tens of thousands of years. And according to First Nations people, since time immemorial. So we're definitely able to think about continuity of culture over, if we can think of continuity of culture over tens of thousands of years, why can't we think about it over a timescale of at least a few centuries? And if we're talking about at least a few centuries, then we're definitely, if you try and extrapolate a 3% growth trend, even a 1% growth trend, you get to quite outlandish numbers over those sorts of timeframes. So we need to be having that bigger conversation. I was at a screening of Regenerating Australia, the film by Damon Gameau, a follow-up to his film 2040, both excellent films. I highly recommend you find your way to a screening if you haven't. And the one I was at 2 nights ago was followed by a Q&A session with Damon, the filmmaker. And it was absolutely fantastic. He was so good at answering these questions. He's crafting a vision for a future, and he's not shying away from these issues. But he was asked about the same question, and he used the phrase, we need a very adult conversation. And it's not a conversation that we've had yet, because the intersection between the need to, on the one hand, grow our renewable future, while on the other hand, do that within a future that is going to stop growing. That's a complicated conversation. And it intersects with our cultural norms, at least from the the couple of 100 years of since the Industrial Revolution, where we have become accustomed to each successive generation inheriting sort of more material, I guess, more inheriting material progress. So what is now normal in terms of access to computers, the ability to do what we're doing right now, was not normal a generation ago. But what was normal a generation ago, what was not normal, the ability to get in an aeroplane and sort of and reasonably accessibly kind of get virtually anywhere on the planet wasn't as accessible a generation before that. That generation was able to get in a car, which was a lot less accessible a generation before that. And we're kind of accustomed to this story, and it's kind of like, well, really exciting what the next generation will get. That's affected when we start to that narrative is seriously impacted by the recognition that we're actually transitioning out of that industrial revolution, fossil fueled growth story into a renewable fueled non-growth story. And that narrative is one we are struggling with.
Yeah. I think, I mean, there's so many cool things there, James. The first thing I wanted to comment on quickly is this idea called value lock-in. So there's a book that was recently published by this philosopher called William MacAskill, and he argues for a million year worldview, where we conceptualize a future not only to like maybe our kids or their kids, but multiple generations ahead, and really thinking and wrestling with hard questions and existential risks that are actually threatening us, like climate, artificial intelligence, things like this, and asking, if we were to conquer these really big problems, how we could, our species could go on to millions of years if we are able to fight off the challenges that we face. And one of the concepts he includes in the book, I haven't read it, I've just watched a lot of podcasts about the book, but I'm venturing to read it when I get the time, is this idea called value lock-in, which is essentially where an idea permeates a culture so deeply that it sustains itself multiple generations. So for example, I see the religion is a good idea of a good way of conceptualizing value lock-in, where this idea of God, religion sustains itself millennia, and it remains till today. And I see growth as a very similar thing, where this idea of growth from the 1600s onwards has remained ever present in our culture. And it's so embedded that even our scientists who are creating models on the next 100 years include it in the base assumption. So that, I mean, perhaps that's an indictment, but I see it more as a indication or a reflection of where our culture is. And so I suppose this is a long way of saying that we have to be good ancestors, where we can really say, okay, I mean, 100 years is great, but what about 1,000 years? Like, if we destroy the planet in 900 years, it's not going to be much good beyond that, right? So we have to make sure, how do we figure out to sustain ourselves in, I guess, in a million-year worldview? And then I guess the last comment I'll say is that change seems to be, I mean, you're alluding to it, that we need some sort of really deep fundamental change, where we change the norms in which, how we live, the ways we live. I saw that you wrote some papers on like hydroponic plants and stuff. And I've talked to someone about this, where you just, have all these plants growing in like really small spaces with really efficient water systems, just basically changing everything from, how we plant food, what we eat, where we eat, where we live, like those fundamental changes. So I don't know, this is just a way of me saying that I agree with you.
Well, that's great. I think some of those things, million-year worldview, that can be a difficult concept. 1,000-year worldview is difficult enough.
Mm.
and probably a 1,000-year worldview is good enough for now in terms
Yeah.
of moving the conversation beyond
Yes. Yeah.
like a 2050 worldview. Because the problem with a 2050 worldview is we can be inclined to think if we can get those emissions down to zero by 2050, that's it, problem solved, we move on, green growth, here we come. So we need to contextualize the urgency of the climate problem within at least a 1,000-year worldview would be good enough for now, and then maybe we can expand that once we start to uncover problems that are relevant over a longer time frame. So, and even at 1,000 years, if you do any sort of back of the envelope calculation, you can do it in a spreadsheet if you want to do a little exponential growth function on 1% growth for 1,000 years. You'll be astonished at the sorts of numbers you get to, and whatever you're starting with. If you want to start with population, if you want to start with energy consumption, you get to crazy numbers. It doesn't matter whether that energy comes from renewable energy. I mean, over these sorts of fairly modest, like a couple of 1,000-year time frame, you can do these calculations that say, well, let's imagine our energy grows at whatever it's currently growing at, a couple of percent per year. Extend that out a few thousand years, you get to the point where all of that, and let's imagine it's beautiful, clean, green, renewable energy. The energy being emanated from all of the solar panels and wind turbines would need to be equivalent to the entire output of the sun. Like it's just, it gets to these stupid, meaninglessly large numbers that mean that you can challenge that growth paradigm very, very quickly. So the stories that we need, we need stories, basically. That's why I'm a big fan of the work that Damon Gameau is doing, because he's a storyteller. And in terms of, you alluded to some of this other research that I've been involved in to do with urban agriculture and things like that. The reason that I'm attracted to that is not because I see some high tech. I mean, I've got some interests in some of these high tech ideas, but it's not because I think the future is going to be this incredibly high tech future. It's actually related back to the concept of growth, and that brings us to the system of scale. And really, it's a capitalism and kind of a power story. So why does growth exist, and why has growth become the dominant, that multi-generational sort of story that you've talked about throughout the Industrial Revolution? It is actually intimately connected to the Industrial Revolution, because when you have a powerful, rich person who is able to replace workers with a machine, then we're talking about systems of production becoming extremely labor efficient, and a wonderful way to return money back to the person who had the money in the first place, because they can now spend their capital on machines that do the work, they displace the workers. And so that creates, on a societal level, an imperative for growth, because all of those displaced workers have to find employment somewhere else. So society effectively has to continue to reinvent itself to find gainful employment for all the people who keep being displaced by the industrialization, the machines of industrialization. And so we have this growth story, and the recurring theme here is that the people with the power and the money then are able to continue to push the people without the power and the money out further and further. The system grows as a result, and you have more and more concentration of wealth and power in the industrialists, if you like. So
it's
that
a way of decentralizing power in order to help those who may not have had the means to have the means.
Right. So if you take agriculture as an example, then you can see this. You can actually see it borne out in the data over my lifetime. The average size of a farm in Australia has doubled. So, and the average, the proportion of the workforce employed in sort of the forestry and agriculture sector has halved. So basically, we're seeing a hollowing out of that means of production, or rather a displacement of people from that means of production. And now it's large tracts of land being tended by ever-increasing more machines of ever-increasing size. So that's a tangible example. If you've been into a farming area at seeding time or at harvesting time, you will have seen the size of some of these machines, especially in the cereal growing. areas. So now this flip side to that is that part of that story has probably made farming quite efficient in some regards, and I think there's some unresolved questions around the sort of efficient scale. But thinking about it from that system of growth point of view, if we have other areas of the economy where these same sorts of trends have happened, and more automation has pushed people into other jobs or even other industries, while the machines basically return profits back to the people who own them, then that's a system that is optimized around the idea that that we want to maximize the amount of money being returned to the shareholder, and so it rewards capital, and it basically says the aim of the game is to become more labor efficient. So this productivity idea, the amount of GDP generated per unit of work being done. So it's kind of a noble goal in a way, but it's because it's kind of saying we want our economy to produce more for the amount of work, but the unintended consequence is that the whole thing grows and keeps pushing people out. If we repivot that optimization around more of a social objective, we might find that we actually start to turn the cycle back around on itself. So instead of having this ever increasing scale where you go to something that's bigger, you then spend less on labor, that returns more profit, so you can spend it on an even bigger machine to push out even more labor, to displace even more labor, to return an even bigger profit, and this cycle just gets bigger. Instead, what if we could bring that back around the other way, where the output of that optimization would be more and more jobs for people, optimal scale, appropriate technology, and so sort of having a societal or a business model that is geared around that, rather than the idea that we need to continually improve productivity. Sorry, you're trying to say something and I keep talking.
No. I think I was just going to comment and just, I think, tie what we've all been talking about into that one point that you're making, which I think is the one of the main points, I would say, is that metrics like GDP, even if they are to grow consistently, 2 to 3% every year for a number of years, they don't necessarily account for the needs of people and their individual share of wealth. So it does a really good job at capturing, general economic activity and assisting those who have the means of production and helping them generate even more wealth. But it doesn't necessarily help with that distribution of wealth. It doesn't necessarily help with improving well-being on average. It doesn't help those specific needs. And so overall, all the things, such as your example, like urban agriculture, this is a way or a signal to say that we want to account for the needs of people, and that one of those needs is, making sure that we have enough money to live the way that we would like to live through, farming and doing those things. We want to make sure that we meet people's needs in the best possible way. And so addressing limits in a way that accounts for people's needs and well-being seems like the overall message. And I feel like perhaps more right-leaning people will be very concerned of the manner in which we're speaking, in the sense of, we need to overturn everyone that has a lot of wealth, do like a 99% tax, get rid of all their wealth, distribute it evenly. Well, I don't necessarily think that's the point of this discussion. More say it's to say that this system perpetuates a certain idea and ideology, and degrowth or things like this are essentially asking us just to take into account limits and then take into account people's needs and well-being and essentially aim to improve those things. And I don't think that's a radical idea at all. I think that's quite a rational idea.
I think it comes back to common sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think of GDP like going back to the car metaphor. So imagine all of the gauges and things on the dashboard. So you've got a fuel gauge, you've got a temperature gauge, you've got the speedo, you've got the tachometer, how many revs you're doing, maybe a few other gauges there. Imagine just mushing all of those into a single gauge that just says vehicle activity. And you're driving along and you're just watching that gauge.
Yeah.
It tells you nothing of any use. And that's essentially GDP. GDP aggregates all of the activity that's happening. It doesn't tell you how much of that activity is good, how much of that is compatible with well-being or is actually against well-being. And so really, we're just talking about looking at the right measures. Some of the best things in life can't be measured anyway. And so we need to maybe have a more of a qualitative view with some of this stuff as well. But I don't think that it shouldn't be. Now it might be, but it shouldn't be so controversial to say, hey, maybe the things that we measure in our economy should actually reflect societal well-being.
Yes. Yeah. And I think
why is that such a controversial idea?
I think if I was to play devil's advocate, maybe even framing it as we have to measure the right things, people may take issue. Well, this is just another way of you trying to insert and shoehorn ideas of limits into our fantastic, eccentric way of living. I want to be able to buy 3 cars and eat as much meat as I like. I mean, I think perhaps to change the wording, perhaps even not framing it as right, but just trying to find multiple metrics rather than one metric to conceive of a life that is worth living. And I don't think that's radical at all. I think, like you said, it's common sense. And
yeah, I think that this is some of the basis for the donut economics approach, which is a clever way of kind of creating a dashboard that allows you to kind of in one place. It's not a point on a graph, but you can look at it and give you a snapshot in time, and you can look at one of those donut economics plots, and you can go to Kate Rayworth's website and see a really nice interactive graphic that illustrates this, how it can be used as a dashboard. And you can sort of stand on the other side of the room and look at it, and if it's got heaps of red emanating out from the outsides of the donut, that means that you're exceeding planetary boundaries, and they should all be brought back into the outer ring of the donut. And if it's got heaps of red poking in from the center in the whole of the donut, then you're not meeting the sort of the minimum requirements in terms of human well-being. So if you just looked at it from a distance and you just saw a nice green ring with no red on the outside and no red on the inside, then you'd be like, oh, that's a good society that's living within its limits, and it's providing the means for people to live a good life. So these alternative ways of us actually framing the purpose of the economy and what it means to be living well and to have an economy that is doing a good job of delivering the needs of the people within the limits that we have to live in, that shouldn't be controversial. And I think we can actually start calling bullshit on people who try to say that is controversial. And we can say, well, what do you think we should be doing then?
Yeah.
And if they want to say,
the good life?
Sorry?
What is the good life? I mean,
yeah, well, how would you, and I think we can push back when people start to say things that imply there aren't limits. The biggest challenge we have there is that some of the richest men in the world, and they are men, and that might be a problem for another that we could talk about in another episode, or you should probably get a very different voice to mine to talk about that. But the richest men in the world are currently perpetuating an idea that we are going to overcome this problem ultimately by finding other planets to live on. And that is unfortunately sitting there as these, we have these stories that we tell ourselves about superheroes and things like that. And there is a part of us that is inclined to believe that these superhero billionaires are going to somehow break through these limits, and we're going to become one of those societies that we've read about in science fiction or watched in movies and things like that. And that's problematic to this discourse, I think. But it's probably
James, haven't you seen their spacesuits? They're so cool. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, way cool. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I think, like you said, that it plays into our narratives and our myths of having a hero or someone to come and save the day, which is very compelling because from as young as we were, these stories resonate with us and we can identify with them very easily. And a part of the podcast that we try to do is think about alternative narratives or ways of living, because like you've identified, that's how people think. People don't necessarily think in facts. Obviously, we use facts to inform our stories, but we construct a story of our lives, what we find is meaningful to us. And based on that, we make decisions. I mean, that's maybe very pseudo psychology, but that's just my sense from speaking to all sorts of people on the podcast with Shashwat. I think this would be a good way of wrapping up and getting a sense from you. So I think we were a bit largely in agreement. And I think this would call for another podcast where perhaps we bring in multiple people to debate these ideas, because I'd like to suspend my worldview and see if maybe the hegemony of growth is the way to go. But what is the way forward, James, in terms of the economy, or what do we just need to value well-being and environmental impact, and it'll be happy days, or like what do you see as the way forward?
Well, I mean, I think there's the way forward. Okay, let's try and sum this up in a few ways. So we've already talked about there's the immediate challenge for the duration of everyone's career, or most people's career who are listening to your podcast or watching. That's the climate challenge and the energy transition. There's in Damon Gamo's words, very adult conversation that we need to have about what we might call 1,000-year time horizon or longer. Then there's there's those two things, but then there's the here and now. And so to riff off the name of your podcast, Utopia is Now, I would challenge everyone to actually start thinking about really tangible here and now stories that we can start talking about that aren't growth dependent. So I'm thinking, okay, let's imagine you support a football team and it's the start of the footy season. Do you get out your spreadsheet from last year and say, okay, how many goals did we kick? How many points did we score? And I'm just going to apply my 3% compound, and our target for the team is this many goals and this many points and this many wins and so on. If you grow pumpkins, do you sort of weigh all of your pumpkins and then say, right, 3% or 5% growth this year, my target is 25.7 kilograms of pumpkins because that's 3% more than last year? No, you just look forward to the season and you hope it's going to be a good season. Okay, if you're into fishing, likewise, if you're into whatever, we actually have these stories. We have things that we look forward to, and I think it's part of that cyclical thing. If you celebrate Christmas, you don't sort of think, oh right, well, my target number of gifts this year is X because X is 3% more than last year. You look forward to it for different reasons. You look forward to seeing the people. You look forward to the food and drink. You might look forward to the presents, but not in that kind of quantitative growth way. And so I think we can tell ourselves these narratives and tell other people these narratives because they actually are indicative that whilst we have deluded ourselves thanks to the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of great things have come out of those successive technological changes, we're not actually that far from a non-growth mindset. And we don't have to look very far. We don't have to scratch below the surface to realize that all those things that bring us joy are not actually growth things. They're things and so I think that maybe you were already on that, which is why you came up with Utopia is Now. But I think it's within our grasp. So
I'll have to leave it as a mystery. No, no, I think just to summarize that, because it's, I think, quite an interesting way of conceiving of how to, I guess, fight the good fight in a sense, is that to think of to challenge growth, not only in like in political discourse, but in the discourse of our everyday life when it comes to Christmas or what we're growing in our garden, or maybe even if you have kids, you know, what is a good way to improve my child's grades? Is it to ensure that they're studying 3% more every night, or is it to find more effective ways of studying? And I think that's the subtle nuance of limits, is not saying completely end progress. It is saying stop seeing progress as expansion. Progress or prosperity can be conceived of doing things smarter and better, not necessarily have to constantly expand and expand. And I think that's the subtle nuance in which you illustrated through those examples. And yeah, I think that's a fantastic message and way to sort of go forward. Very, very lastly, James, we ask all of our guests this question, which is obviously related to Utopia. If you want to tell a story, we'd love to know what your Utopia looks like in as many or few words as you like.
Utopia is not a busy place. Utopia is a place where people have time for one another and for the things that matter. I think that's part of what gets us into the problem. People are too busy to actually spend the time thinking about it. So I think that if we've solved the problem, presumably part of that is that people are going to have a lot more time to focus on things, things that we might consider to be humble, like growing pumpkins in the backyard or going fishing or something. Something like that. A simpler way of being.
Yeah, voluntary simplicity as the name of one's institute by a professor in Melbourne who.
Samuel Alexander.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, look, I think that wraps everything up very well, James. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure, and I'd love to have you on again, hopefully with our co-host next time.
I'd love that. Thanks so much for having me. It's been wonderful talking with you.